Oh, Portuguese, a language that I find to be quite pretty. It was once the language of an empire that stretched from the Americas to Africa, even all the way out into Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Today, it's still spoken across the globe, specifically in Africa and America, but it's not quite the lingua franca that it once was. So, what exactly happened to this language that once held such a vast influence? Why did the Portuguese fade from its position as a leader in global trade? And which version should you study? Let's take a deep dive into the history, the present, and the future of Portuguese, and which dialect you should choose to study when you start your Portuguese journey. So, in the 15th century, Portugal had one of the most powerful empires in the world. They had colonies and trade routes that stretched from Brazil to Africa to Asia. Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama or Ferdinand Magellan mapped the world's oceans, while Lisbon became the center of the spice trade. Portuguese was not just a language of the Iberian Peninsula, but became a language of world trade. And across the globe, Portuguese became this language of both trade as well as diplomacy. Right? In Goa, in India, in Macau, in China, Portuguese wasn't just spoken by the colonial authorities. It became the lingua franca and was spoken by many people from many different nationalities to encourage trade. Right? From everybody from Portuguese traders, Indian merchants, to Chinese officials. Portuguese was the language of commerce in these regions, used to broker deals and connect vastly different cultures. However, like any empire, the Portuguese Empire's days were numbered. In the 17th century, Portugal begins to lose control of a lot of its colonies. That, mixed with the rise of European powers like Britain, France, and the Netherlands, shifted the balance of global trade, and Portuguese influence started to wane. Brazil, which was like the crown jewel of the empire, it was their source of resources, gold, silver, minerals, things like that, gained independence in 1822, and then other Portuguese colonies like Angola and Mozambique followed suit in the mid 20th century. As independence movements swept across Africa and decolonization started to happen for everybody from the French to the Portuguese to even the Germans were a little involved out there. So these shifts in attitude and cultural acceptance of these shifts in attitude towards the Europeans, combined with the economic difficulties that Portugal was facing back home as their global trade dominance started to wane, meant that Portuguese started to lose its power as a language of global commerce and trade. Right? It was no longer the language of the world's empires. Instead, English, Spanish, and French took center stage as global languages of commerce and diplomacy. Now, for me, two of the most interesting places that Portuguese was known to have taken place is Goa in the Indian subcontinent, and Macau, way out in China. For centuries, Portuguese was actually the bridge between the East and the West, which is why they came to dominate the spice market. In Goa, the language of Portuguese became the language of trade and administration. And here, Portuguese would mix with some of the local Indian dialects to form its own special version of Portuguese as a lingua franca. Everybody from traders to priests to travelers used it as a common language in one of the busiest commercial ports of the time. And then in Macau, Portuguese was the language through which Portuguese traders and explorers conducted business with Chinese officials and merchants. The Portuguese presence in Macau lasted to the mid 20th century, and even today, it retains an interesting mix of Portuguese and Cantonese culture. However, with the independence of Goa in the 60s and the independence of Macau in the 90s, Portuguese lost its official status in these places and generally faded as a daily language of communication, instead being replaced by, in the case of Macau, Chinese, and in India, various Indian languages. So several factors contributed to the fall of Portuguese in the world. One was the rise of English as a language of business, science, and technology. As countries like the US and the UK came to dominate these industries, to be bringing about new ideas in the space of technology and trade and commerce and diplomacy, English trended up towards being a world language and the language that was preferred for communication. And in the former Portuguese colonies, even though Portuguese stayed on as a language, especially in Mozambique, in Angola, and in Brazil, there became a much more bigger focus on nationalism and also into bringing back and protecting some of the more local languages and the cultural identities that are associated with them. And finally, Portugal's own struggles, from economic problems to just the small size of the country in and of itself running such a large empire meant that the global influence of Portuguese in Portugal started to diminish. Without the robust empire it had once had, Portugal and Portuguese was no longer able to maintain its stranglehold as being a language of trade, commerce, and diplomacy. Now, let's get to the most important question. Which version of Portuguese should you learn? Right? My personal answer is that I chose to study the Brazilian version of Portuguese. Right? For me, this is the best sounding variety of Portuguese, and it's also the one that is, for me, the easiest to learn coming from a background of already speaking Spanish. If you're drawn to the music that they produce, the rhythm in the speech, and the warmth of the language and the environment of Brazil, Brazilian Portuguese is the option you should focus on. It's the most widely spoken version of the language. It has the most materials to learn it, and the most people, especially if you're in the Americas, to practice with. It's also, for most people, the easiest to learn because it shares a lot of vocabulary with Spanish. It sounds much more similar to Spanish, right? Both in vocabulary and structure. And plus, it just has a more musical and nicer on the ear sound than European Portuguese does, right? Making it most pleasant to speak as well as to hear. On the other hand, if you're more of a history buff and you want to learn or you want to live in Portugal, European Portuguese is the one for you. It's faster paced. It sounds a little bit like they're speaking Russian. For me, I really struggle to understand it. It's got a more closed pronunciation and tends to clip out vowels a lot more than Brazilian Portuguese, right? So it may be a little harder for beginners, but especially if you're going to live there or you're just interested in that country, this might be an option for you to explore. And then if you're interested in exploring the African subcontinent, specifically those two colonies of Angola and Mozambique, right? Then maybe you look for more of a African style of Portuguese, right? Which my understanding is it's in the middle between Brazilian and European, right? In the way in which it's spoken, right? It's more of an intermediate between the two, right? However, the thing to be careful with here is that they're going to draw on a lot of native languages. There's going to be a lot of words that are adapted from these native languages into Portuguese and are not standard Portuguese words, right? Which is also something you see in Brazil as well, where they've taken words from the indigenous languages and adapted them into Portuguese, something that the Portuguese of Portugal does not do. If you're a surfer and you're wanting to get way out there, you should definitely look into the Brazilian or the African version of Portuguese. If you want to be a little bit more on the map, Brazil. If you want to be a little bit more off the map, a little bit on your own and exploring unknown breaks, African Portuguese is the way to go. So Portuguese has had its rise and fall as a global language, but today it still holds a special place in the hearts of millions across the globe. Right? Whether you're drawn to the samba of Brazil, the charm of Lisbon, or the chance to get a little bit off the beaten path by discovering places like Angola and Mozambique, Portuguese offers a super rich linguistic and cultural journey for you. Ultimately, the best Portuguese to pick is the one that excites you most. For me, I like Brazil. I've been once. I would like to go back. And it's also the one that I'm going to run into the most if I go to the States as well, is that Brazilian Portuguese, right? So for me, it's the one that makes the most sense. It's also the country that I am most interested in, right? And a good thing to keep in mind is when you're picking a dialect, it's not like the end-all be-all, right? I might choose to learn Brazilian Portuguese now, but if I go to live in Lisbon or I go to travel around Mozambique, maybe I learn more of their dialect, right? It's something that can change and adapt and grow with you as you grow within the language, right? Regardless of whatever version you choose, Portuguese is going to open doors to a fascinating world of culture, history, and connection with people from all over the globe. Muito obrigado for watching this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe. Use the contact information down below if you want to join a Spanish class, whether that's private lessons or a group class. And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe, all that stuff. Leave any comments, anything you want me to do in the future down below. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.